Welcome back to everyone. This is your host Marv, and you are listening Verano 1711 podcast. Today, the episode is set. We're going to be having a discussion here, a conversation with two scholars about the composition of the Pentateuch. How about that? Important topic. This is a foundational text. And this is a brand new book, just come out, this book. And I was telling them off camera that this is something that I'm just, I need to have the conversation. And what better to do with these two gentlemen? So I am joined by Professors Gary Rendsburg. Oh, there you go. Thank you. That's beautiful. Okay, I'm set to get my own copy on my birthday. So I am joined by Professor Gary Rendsburg and Professor Ron Gane. Gentlemen, thank you for being here and kindly accepting our invitation. Welcome. How are you doing today?
Good to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
My pleasure indeed. So, first things first, I'm going to ask you, both of you, to go and introduce yourself, a bit of a background, who you are for the wider audience. So we're going to go with Professor Rendsburg first.
So I teach at Rutgers University in New Jersey. We are the State University of New Jersey. I have been here since 2004, so for 22 years now. I hold a chair in Jewish history, the Blanche and Irving Laurie Chair in Jewish history. And I teach a wide variety of topics, obviously biblical studies, which is my core work, but also Jewish history survey, ancient and medieval, courses on manuscripts, both Hebrew manuscripts, but also Arabic, Latin, Greek, and English manuscripts. I teach a course on that. And Dead Sea Scrolls, Egyptology. So I do quite a bit. Ugaritic, of course, which is primary to biblical studies. And it's just a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, sir. Professor Gane, you're up next.
Yes, I'm originally from Australia, moved to this country of the United States at the age of 7. Much later, ended up at the University of California, Berkeley. I earned my PhD with Professor Jacob Milgram. Among others. There were other teachers who came to teach there, but he was my major professor. And I got hooked on ritual studies. I had no interest in Leviticus before that. In fact, I was I was repulsed by the book. So my father taught a course in the biblical sanctuary when I was an undergraduate as a theology major. I didn't even bother to take his course because I was that uninterested in Leviticus. And when I got to Berkeley and I found that Milgram was specializing in Leviticus, I was very disappointed. But then I got hooked in it and ended up writing my dissertation in that. Study with him there as well as other professors who came to visit and so on, including and then studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem under professors like Professor Weinfeld, and Moshe Greenberg was at Berkeley. I studied with him there, although he was from the Hebrew U. So then I ended up teaching at Pacific Union College for a couple of years and then came to Andrews University, where I've been teaching Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern languages for the last 32 years. So my specialty is really in biblical law, including ritual law, especially the cultic system of ancient Israel against its ancient Near Eastern background. And then I also teach languages like Akkadian, Ugaritic, Hittite, Aramaic. I even taught New Testament Greek for a little bit, a number of different languages. And I'm about to retire this next year. I can hardly wait to have more time to write and things like that.
Great. Awesome. Guys, big names there, the legends. I mean, and Professor Rendsburg, correct me if I'm wrong, but you study under the great, for some, the great of the greatest, Cyrus Herschel Gordon. So big names right there.
I did.
What a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was
for the audience who doesn't know, Cyrus Gordon was one of the greats of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Probably along with W.F. Albright, those would be the two names that people would recognize and would know. And he was just a master. He was a master of all the languages. I mean, Roy just mentioned all the languages that he teaches. Cyrus taught all of those, plus Egyptian and so on. Of course, I studied all those languages with Professor Gordon. Not Hittite. I studied Hittite for a year with somebody else. But although Gordon certainly also knew Hittite, he was the teacher of Harry Hofner. In fact, Roy, you probably know that.
Oh, really?
Wow!
I didn't know that.
Hofner did his PhD with Gordon at Brandeis, and Hofner went on to become the great Hittitologist of the U.S. at the University of Chicago. In any case, we used to call him Cyrus the Great. He was a phenomenal scholar and phenomenal teacher, and just a wonderful, wonderful human being. Yeah, died in the year 2001. Yeah,
Yeah. We're sad. Dr. Rendsburg and I are sad about the whole generation of our teachers is gone. And we love them so much, and they gave us so much. We have an incredible debt to them.
that is so very, very true. I tell my colleagues, Roy, Gane, and others included, we knew that our teachers, our students will only know us.
Right, right. That's
and
it.
We paled in comparison to those individuals.
Yeah.
Roy mentioned some of them, like Moshe Greenberg and Jacob Milgram and Cyrus Gordon on my end, and so many others. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, I think you got muted there.
Yeah, we're still not hearing you.
Marv, you're muted.
Oh,
Okay.
maybe the power
There's a
went off
hiccup.
again. Well, oh boy. Yeah. Yeah, when I studied Ugaritic, we used Gordon's textbook, Ugaritic textbook. Yeah, that was a very helpful
It was the
resource.
only thing there was, the only volume we had. Yeah.
That's right. That's it. There are so many resources now that we didn't have, including for Sumerian. Sumerian was very difficult, and we just didn't have. They didn't have the full understanding of the language. They have a lot more now.
Right.
Probably not full, but yeah.
Let me know if you can hear me well.
Now you're back. Yes.
You're back.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So, as I was saying to these two gentlemen off camera, we want to respect and value their time. So let's go straight to the questions. You already saw the book right there. You need to get your copy. I'm going to be dropping a link here. You click on it and you're set to get your own copy. Please do it if you want to be up to speed with the latest of scholarship on this topic. So the first question going to be popping up on your screen. Let me know if you can see it. And we're going to start with a brief history of the hypothesis, this famous topic about the documentary hypothesis. So I'll go with you first, Professor Rendsburg. Help us with that.
Well, the documentary hypothesis was formulated in the 19th century. Scholars then, and of course down to the present day, noticed, and no one can debate this, that there are a variety of places in the Torah or the Pentateuch, passages which disagree with one another. I mean, all you have to do is start in Genesis 1 and 2, and you find two different creation accounts. In the first creation account, Genesis chapter 1, for example, the human couple is created last at the end of creation. And in Genesis chapter 2, the first thing created is man, and only later is woman created. So you have two differences there, the order of creation, and also the fact that in the first story, a human couple, male and female together, and in the second story, separately. And you have other examples of this, the question of how many animals did Noah bring on the ark, and the identity of Esau's wives, and a whole variety of such issues in the narrative books, which is mainly Genesis and half of Exodus and parts of Numbers. And then you get other major differences between Leviticus and Deuteronomy regarding the festivals, regarding the rituals, and Roy Gane can speak more about that than I can. Just one example, Leviticus and Numbers refer to the holiday of Yom Kippur, and totally unmentioned in the book of Deuteronomy as an example. So because of that, the scholars of the 19th century, culminating with the work of Julius Wellhausen, great German scholar of the 1870s and 80s, came up with this idea that the Pentateuch was the result of four separate authors called J, E, D, and P. And the sources, J, E, D, and P, were basically in that order. J, the oldest from the 10th century, down to P, the priestly source, as late as the 6th or 5th century, exilic or post-exilic in the Persian period. And that has been the dominant hypothesis in scholarship for a century and a half, if not longer. There have been dissenting voices, and two of them are here today, Roy Gane and Gary Rendsburg, amongst others, including our co-editors, whose names you see on the book cover.
Yeah.
And we prefer to look at these texts holistically. We don't sweep those differences that I just mentioned under the rug. They're there. We don't want to deny them, but we do want to look at the way that the Torah or Pentateuch came to be a text, a unified text, against the background of the ancient Near East, where one finds similar compositions which are unified, and no one questions that, notwithstanding the occasional differences and hiccups, as I like to say. So that's a very brief overview of the documentary hypothesis, and our book, we'll call it RCP for short, Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch, brings to the scholarly world and also the general lay readership essays, several dozen essays on the different genres of the books of the Torah, the law, the narrative, the rituals, and so on, and the dating of those texts, and tries to present a whole new way of looking at the documentary hypothesis. I shouldn't say that, a whole new way of looking at the Torah or Pentateuch, contrary to the division that the documentary hypothesis advances.
Thank you so much. So, Professor Gane, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I think that was a very good overview. Of course, there was a development before the 19th century where scholars were starting to look at the divine names, which is why we get JEDP. J is for Yahwist in German. These were German scholars. J is pronounced Yah. So Yahweh that is the name of the personal name of Israel's God. The Tetragrammaton Yod He Vav He was written with a J because it was pronounced Yah. Okay, so Yahweh. And the idea was that they noticed that, at least they thought there was a pattern of some texts with a certain style were referring to God as Yahweh. That's the pronunciation scholars use for that name, although we don't exactly know how it was to be pronounced. And then other texts seem to be using the name Elohim, which is just the generic name for God, like a title, God. And that's Elohim. So Yahweh, Elohim. And then priestly texts, which would include really the ritual texts and lists and anything that's boring, would go under the heading of P, the priestly text. But before that would be D, the Deuteronomist, which is Deuteronomy. Okay, so Deuteronomy was by itself. And the idea was that J, and then later scholars have combined that with E as being quite early 10th century and so on back there. And there's been a lot of debate. Scholars have just had tremendous disagreements. And then D, Deuteronomy is supposed to be identified with the Book of the Law discovered by the high priest Hilkiah during the reign of Josiah near the end of the Israelite monarchy. So this has been used as an anchor point for dating. And then the so-called priestly texts have been dated later, exilic or post-exilic, which means now, there are tremendous consequences to this, because if P, the priestly texts, are exilic or post-exilic, there never was a wilderness tabernacle, according to scholars who think that it was written during the Persian period. Moses was a legendary figure who didn't actually exist. And so things were written, the Pentateuch, much of it is written with him as the primary character, some of it with him as the author, and this is supposed to be pseudonymous. Okay, so we have a chapter on pseudonymity in this book. Okay, and so the Pentateuch was supposed to have been constructed from an accretion, a development over centuries of these different writings that were then put together by redactors, editors that put the seams together, and that's why we see scholars can recognize where you have apparently one story, another story, or a narrative, and where they're spliced together. You have repetitions, redundancy, all this kind of stuff, all of which is supposed to represent different authors. And there's some current exponents of this who, against the general, in the last number of decades, there's been a lot of pushback against the documentary hypothesis, including, well, a number of years ago, the great Yechezkel Kaufman, who taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, argued instead for JEDP, he argued for JEPD, that is, the priestly texts are earlier, they're pre-exilic.
Yeah.
And my teacher, Jacob Milgram, went with that. Okay, but other scholars have gone beyond that, and some have just ignored it. And there's been differences between scholars in America and in Europe and in Israel, all these different places, a lot of disagreements. And now there's a big book on the formation of the Pentateuch that points these things out. So what we're finding in this book is that these hypotheses are all based upon speculation, overreaching of the data, going beyond the data, not looking carefully enough at the sources, and not looking comprehensively enough at the nature of different kinds of data we have, including archaeological, linguistic, and so on and so forth. And so that's what our book is bringing to the table, is an answer to this whole complex of theory that has dominated the scholarly stage, to the extent that you wouldn't have even been considered to be a scholar in the Pentateuch if you hadn't bowed to the documentary hypothesis as you entered the door. I love what Rolf Rentdorf said to me a number of years ago. We were at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting in Denver, and I attended a session on Pentateuchal source criticism. Chopping up the Pentateuch, into different sources and redactors. And afterwards, I was walking down the escalator, or riding down the escalator from one level to another, with the great German scholar Rolf Rentdorf. And he said to me, his reaction to the session was, "I want to work with real texts, not homemade texts."
Whoa.
In other words, I want to work with texts that we have actual evidence. The evidence we have is the final form of the text. And my Akkadian Ugaritic teacher at Berkeley, Isaac Kikawada, said to me, well, to our class, he said that JEDP are scholarly phantoms that exist in the minds of scholars. But some more recently have been trying to resurrect it. It's called neo-documentarianism, and trying to resurrect this, going back to Wellhausen, but yet different. And some are my friends, good friends. But the idea now is not looking at the divine names, but looking at narrative disjunctures, where you're reading a narrative and you find incoherence, something doesn't fit, like Dr. Rendsburg mentioned, there's some kind of a contradiction, then that must be a different source. So your job is to analyze it, to see where they fit and how they all fit together.
There you go. Oh my God. So, okay, me as a layman, there's a lot of here. I'm trying to be fair, and I just read Richard Elliott Friedman's book because it's always brought up into the discussion here as being one of the most, how can I put it? Best defenses, let's put it that way, about this theory. And then, like I was saying off camera to you, I saw the interview with Bersma and Professor Rendsburg, and I said to myself, okay, now it's time, to turn our attention to what they have to say about this topic. So let's pay attention to them, because my mentor, late Semitic, Michael Heiser, he already passed away. He didn't buy it, and he said many times, one of the problems of the documentary hypothesis is that it's tautological, it's circular reasoning much of the time. I had Professor Everbeck. I'm pretty sure you know him.
Yeah,
Richard Everbeck. Yeah, on the show, and we agreed that much, it's very frequently source critics tend to overstate the data, and that's something that my professor also came up with. So so I'm trying to be fair, but yeah, I'm paying attention to their arguments, and you guys as well. And something is not clicking with me. Something's not, squaring off there. So any comments so far, Professor Rendsburg, before we go to the next question?
I think it might be beneficial for the people listening if we can give some empirical examples, and I'll give two of them.
Okay.
One of them both of them I mentioned already. So let's start with the creation accounts, Genesis 1 and 2. So Genesis 1, this is the way I teach it. There are contradictions in the two stories, as I just mentioned. Not only the order of creation, right? In the first story, it's plants, then animals, then the human couple. In the second story, it's man, vegetation, animals, and then woman. It's also the mode of creation. In the first story, you have creation by fiat. God just speaks, let there be light, and there was light. And in the second story, God actually physically does things using verbs which are typically predicated of humans. So he does this verb yotzer, meaning he creates. It's the same word that's used for a potter creating a pot out of clay. He creates man out of clay in the same way. And then you get the verb ta, to plant. He plants the garden. He plants the garden, and then the verb bana, he builds. He builds Eve out of the hard word to translate there, traditionally translated as the rib of Adam, perhaps the flank, the side of Adam. If you look at the two stories, they have to be read in conjunction with one another. The first story is what I call cosmocentric. The entire cosmos is created. The sky, the dry land, the seas, and everything, the stars, the sun, the moon, vegetation, etc. In the second story, it's anthropocentric. So the only thing that is really created are those things that are here on Earth. And of course, man plays a very prominent role, including tilling the soil, naming the animals, and so on. And the two stories are to be read in conjunction with one another. They're not separate stories. Well, they are separate stories, but they need to be read in conjunction with each other. The cosmocentric one of Genesis 1 and the anthropocentric one of Genesis 2. And you even have a clue, a linguistic or literary clue to this, because in the first story, the pair is referred to as heaven and earth in Genesis 1:1, famously, and again in the end of that story, which is at Genesis 2, first half of verse 4. But then, or first few verses of Genesis 2. But then when the second story is introduced, that pair is reversed. It's now earth and heaven. And that is a literary clue to the reader that the second story is now going to be here on earth, where you have everything that I have just described. And there's a major theological statement being made here by the individual who has taken these two stories and placed them side by side. And it sets the tone for the entire, not just Pentateuch, but for the entire Bible, which is that this is the story of God's relationship with humanity. And you need both God in heaven and the humans on earth. And that's the story. That's the covenantal relationship, first with Noah, and then the very special covenantal relationship with the people of Israel, a small subset of humanity. And all of that is being introduced to you. Remember, there's no theological treatises yet, right? There's no systematic theology. There's no philosophical tradition. You teach through story. And so these are these stories, and the wise, intelligent reader will grasp the lesson of heaven and earth together in Genesis 1 and 2. The second example I want to use is towards the end of the flood story in Genesis 8. Where Wellhausen and everybody else is dividing it up between the P source and the J source. And you have various elements of the story there, including the ark lands on a mountain. Noah sends out birds to determine that the earth is dry. Noah sets everybody free from the ark. And then finally, Noah offers sacrifices to God. If we just take those four elements, according to the JP division of the flood story, two of those elements are J and two of those elements are P. And Wellhausen determined this at exactly the same time that the flood story of Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic was discovered in the British Museum by George Smith, early cuneiform specialist, who then published it At the same time, in fact, gave a public lecture in which Prime Minister Gladstone attended, in which he showed that the Babylonian flood story paralleled the biblical flood story. And if you read the Gilgamesh epic, tab 11, you will see all four of those items in exactly the same order, where Utnapishtim, the ark lands on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out birds to determine whether the land was dry. Yeah. He sets everybody free, and then he offers sacrifices at the end of that narrative. And Wellhausen just turns a blind eye to the ancient Near East. He doesn't understand the great discoveries that are happening, especially in the cuneiform world. He was a first-class Arabist and a first-class Hebraist, but he didn't take the time to learn Akkadian or even the literature in translation. And so here we are 150 years later, and we're still stuck in the quagmire of Wellhausen, here's his book, in which what I've just described, these are facts, and all you have here, I like that expression that Roy Gane mentioned from Isaac Kikuwata, these are just phantoms in the worlds of scholars. The Gilgamesh epic is a real text, and Genesis 8 is a real text. And when you read them together, they are unified texts, not to be divided into the microscopic parts.
Thank you. Professor Gane, any remarks before continuing with the questions?
Well, first of all, I would mention that John Collins wrote a short commentary on Genesis 1 to 4 and pointed out, as Dr. Rendsburg said, that the chapter 2, which really starts, the account starts with 2:4b, going through the end of chapter 2, is anthropocentric. And so what you really have is chapter 2 is then zeroing in. It's not contradictory to chapter 1, but it's focusing on the 6th day of creation. So you have the whole thing, the whole cosmos laid out in this 7 days, ending with the Sabbath, 7th day Sabbath, in verses 2 and 3. And then you have the summary in 2:4a. And then, interestingly, in chiastic reversal of words in 2:4b, moving into then focusing on that 6th day, because the whole focus is anthropocentric. So rather than saying these are two contradictory stories, rather they're two complementary stories. They belong together. They're told from different perspectives, but you need them together. And one is just simply filling and fleshing out the details on chapter 6. On rather the 6th day. So aside, by the way, from the Gilgamesh epic that Dr. Rendsburg mentioned regarding creation, there is the epic of Atrahasis, which also has these elements. And at Berkeley, we read the whole thing in Akkadian. Very, very fascinating. These ancient texts show us that there are kinds of ways of putting compositions together that are very similar to the kind of literature we find in the Bible. And Joshua Berman, who is another member of our group, by the way, we have a scholarly research group called Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch. We've had several conferences here at Andrews University where I teach, and we've been producing volumes. Volume 1 and 2 are out. Volume 3/1 is almost done. And then we have another volume that is in process, and so on. And so in this group, we have Israeli scholars, other American Jewish scholars. We have Protestants, evangelicals, Catholic, Seventh-day Adventists like me. And so we have a whole group of scholars. But one of them, the Israeli scholar from Bar-Ilan University, Joshua Berman, has been doing a lot of research in comparison between the biblical texts and ancient Near Eastern texts, and pointing out that whereas modern scholars, German and American, have been making assumptions of what a coherent text should look like. They then impose that on the biblical text and say, this isn't coherent. But when we look at ancient Near Eastern texts that nobody questions that their authorship is coming from one source, they have the same kinds of apparent incoherence. In fact, this is the way our whole research group got started. It was during a break in my Ugaritic class years ago, and two of my students, Kenneth Berglund and Felipe Massotti, were dialoguing with me about some Ugaritic texts, and we were noticing that there were things in the Ugaritic texts that occurred in the biblical texts that would have been regarded as evidence for more than one source. So as a result, they got interested in this, started studying this, gathered others, and they had an online discussion group, and then we had a conference and another conference, and now we have over 40 members, scholars all over the world, and we keep in touch. We have quarterly meetings. We're doing conferences every 2 years, putting out volumes. This volume is unique. This is our first attempt to put together a volume that is more accessible. It's not a conference volume of scholarship. This is designed as a textbook. Yes, it's for scholars, but it's also for use as a textbook for college and seminary students, with a lot of short essays that are to the point, up to date, have bibliography in them, that are intended to come at the topic from a lot of different angles and just be very concise, putting it all together. So this is a very, very powerful volume. I think there's nothing like it. It's going to make big waves. So I'm really glad that you're recognizing that.
No. That it is indeed. It is indeed. It's a it's a big book, as you were saying. Quick question, Professor Gane. You mentioned John Collins. Is this C. John Collins or John J. Collins? Just to make sure.
C. John Collins.
Oh, thank you.
It's not.
Thank you.
It's not John J., who is the Daniel scholar.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because John J. Collins also was on the show, and we talk about his 4th edition of the Introduction of the Hebrew Bible. And as expected, we touched on this topic of the documentary hypothesis. All right, so let's move on here. So I like this question because it has to do, perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, but the proposal or part, of the proposal you are putting in this book. So what are some of the propositions comprising your positive model for the composition of the Pentateuch? Professor Rendsburg, let's go with you.
Well, one of the propositions is, which we've already mentioned, is to take these texts seriously as texts, as real texts, and not to worry about any prehistory to these texts. I like to tell my students, when we teach Shakespeare, we can talk about the prehistory of Shakespeare's plays because we know the sources that he used for, if it's one of the tragedies, the sources that he used for Hamlet or for Romeo and Juliet. How did he know anything about Julius Caesar? We know what was available to him and what he read and what plays and earlier stories may have been told in poetry and so on. And of course, for his histories, we know what he would have known about the kings of the previous centuries, Henry V and so on. This is what we don't know for the biblical period. All we have is the final form of the text. And so if you start trying to figure out, well, this material is J and this is E and this is P, we'll bracket Deuteronomy for the moment, right? Genesis through Numbers divided up into J, E, and P. To start putting these under a microscope, these are invented texts which never existed in any reality other than in the minds of the scholars who have assumed that they are pre-existing texts. And so our first proposition is take the book of Genesis and read it holistically. Take the book of Exodus and read it holistically. If you want to divide up Exodus into the first half, which is mainly narrative, and the second half, which is about the tabernacle, fine, but read them holistically. Don't break them up into their microscopic parts. They read perfectly fine, right? From the creation of the world to the death and burial of Joseph at the end of Genesis, you get one long, coherent narrative. Little hiccups, as we mentioned, the number of animals that Noah may have taken on board and the identity of Esau's wives and so on and so forth. But just, and read them through literary eyes. Read them through literary eyes, not the literary eyes of a 19th or 20th century scholar trained to read with rational, scientific Aristotelian logic, but through the eyes of an ancient Near Eastern reader, pre-Aristotle, who learned how to read a text and understand a text and comprehend a text in a different literary milieu. So that would be the number one overriding approach of our positive model.
Thank you so much. Professor Gane.
Yes, the introduction, the first chapter, that is to say, of this volume, is called Toward a Positive Model for the Composition of the Pentateuch. And the chapter was written by Kenneth Berglund, Roy Gane, Gary Rendsburg, and A. Rahel Wells, the 4 editors. In this chapter, on pages 6 and 7, it lists 9 primary characteristics of our approach. The first is we look at the final form of the text, which is all that we have, as Dr. Rendsburg said. Secondly, we'll look at comparative evidence, comparative analysis, looking at comparing the Bible with ancient Near Eastern texts, so that we don't just make modern assumptions about the ancient text. Thirdly, we look carefully at diachronic linguistics, historical linguistics. What kind of language is being used? And there's evidence presented in this volume that it's the classical period of Hebrew. It's not late biblical Hebrew, which is represented in the Pentateuch. And there is empirical evidence for that. And then we have literary coherence. We find that, as Dr. Rendsburg mentioned, that you can read the Pentateuch. It's not just unreadable. It's not something that is doesn't make sense. And we don't have to just pull it apart. Now, one of the driving factors behind source criticism is the idea of trying to get back to the source, because we want to find out, does this have to do with God? I'm reminded of Moshe Greenberg's class on Ezekiel at Berkeley, where he mentioned that among critical scholars, there was a huge divergence of opinion as to what went back to the prophet Ezekiel. And from Holscher, who recognized only an original less than 20 verses or so, to Forer, who it was a lot more, was original. And the driving force was what went back to the original prophet was what went back to God, okay, which is authoritative, okay? And so one of the original, I think it was Semler, one of the original founders of the development of the documentary hypothesis and this historical criticism, Semler regarded the scripture as being in the Bible. That is to say, the inspired message from God is something that is in here. And we have to act like archaeologists. We have to get back to the original so that and I've done archaeology. My wife is an archaeologist, okay?
Yeah.
And so you dig through all kinds of stuff that's extraneous, right? You put it to one side in a big heap, and you're looking for the treasure, the kernel of treasure, and that is the scripture. Well, that's not what the Bible says about itself. It doesn't intend to be taken that way. It tends to be taken holistically, as Dr. Rendsburg said. Okay, so literary coherence, and I've written, in fact, in reaction to Joel Baden, who is one of the top very prominent neo-documentarians, and he wrote a book about this, and I responded to him in an essay in one of our published now volumes of the Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch series volumes, published by the Bulletin for Biblical Research series. And yeah, from Eisenbrauns, you're right. Yeah. And so I published in there, pointed out in his introduction, he lists all of these different contradictions or problems with redundancy, repeated stories. For example, Moses striking the rock, right? These kinds of things. And I went in and I looked at each of them exegetically to see, is this necessarily a real contradiction, or is it just apparent? Are these stories complementary or contradictory? And I discovered that in a lot of these cases, and of course, it doesn't prove everything, but there's quite a number of them, different kinds of these that I discovered were in fact just apparent contradictions. You couldn't prove exegetically that they were actually mistakes in the biblical text. Okay, so literary coherence, then literary reuse and direction of dependence, which is important because we have the dating, and scholars agree on dating of books like Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and others. We have pretty clear dating. And the way that the Pentateuch refers to other books, or other books refer to the Pentateuch, makes a difference as to the relative chronology. And so we're looking at that. Now, one of the main reasons why Wellhausen thought that the Pentateuch must be late, for one thing, was his anti-Semitism. He was he thought that monotheism, ethical monotheism, was the earliest pristine form of the prophets, and he thought that there was then a degeneration into legalistic Judaism, of which P, the priestly source, was a part. Okay, so that's one thing. But also, he didn't find so much evidence for the rituals in the priestly materials in the narratives. But one of the reasons for that is clear in the narratives, and that is because of apostasy from one generation to another. And the Bible says
Yeah.
this, the Passover wasn't observed in this way since however many centuries. Okay, so literary reuse and direction of dependence, and then internal evidence and historical context of the composition, comparing with ancient Near Eastern evidence. For example, Scotty Baker has here an essay on the materials used in the construction of the tabernacle. And he points out, he's an Egyptologist, Egyptian specialist, and he points out that the materials that are indicated here in the biblical text in Exodus for the construction of the sanctuary are materials that belonged to the New Kingdom period, okay, which is approximately when scholars date the framework. That is, aside from the authorship, there is the historical narrative setting, and it correlates with the narrative setting in Egypt during a certain period that is way pre-exilic, way before the Persian period. So these are kinds of empirical evidence. In fact, later people in the Persian period would not have known these kinds of materials. They wouldn't have written it that way. And so then we have to recognize limited evidence for textual prehistory. We need to recognize the limitations of evidence. Here is where we stop. We cannot prove, we don't have any statues of Moses like we do of Gudea, okay, 2100 BC or so. We don't have that kind of proof. We have to have limited evidence that we accept. And then the dating of the Pentateuch based upon a lot of these different factors, and Israelite literacy. When could the Israelites have produced this kind of literature? And scholars thought, oh, writing wasn't even invented as alphabetic writing until later, and therefore Moses, if he was in the middle of, say, if he was in the second millennium, and some scholars date it to closer to the middle of the second millennium or later during the time of Ramses the second during the 13th century, but writing wasn't developed to that point. Well, we've got articles here by Richard Hess that he points out we do have texts. Archaeologists have found texts. There was writing. They could have done it this way, including alphabetic writing. So what we're doing is coming at these items of data from a lot of different areas, not just triangulating or quadrangulating or quintangulating. We're coming at it from a lot of different angles.
Yeah.
And we're data driven. We don't care about the speculative theories. We come to the text. We want to look at data. Show me the data. That's what we want to find.
Yeah. Now I need to ask this to Professor Rendsburg. Do you remind any quote or any remarks from Cyrus, your professor, about this hypothesis? Because it is my, I know, but that evangelicals, they were just ready to uproot for Professor Gordon because he was a very strong voice against this theory. Professor Rendsburg.
Right. So Professor Gordon, and he was a bit of a maverick because of that. Even W.F. Albright. Albright came out of a pretty conservative Christian background, but still, bottom line, I believe, accepted the documentary hypothesis. And Gordon broke with him over that and with all the other scholars at a time when almost nobody did. And he had his reasons for doing so. And some of it was, as Professor Gane mentioned, because he was a specialist in Ugaritic and he was reading Ugaritic material. And he saw, yes, I mean, Baal is sometimes called Baal and he's sometimes called Had or Hadu, which means the thunderer. Well, it's a little bit like the split between Yahweh and Elohim. And even in Genesis 2 and 3, when you have a single double name, Yahweh Elohim, in those two chapters, well, you get that as well with deities in Ugaritic, where the two names that they have are fused into a single name. Kothar Wachas probably being the best example. But Gordon's famous quip, which I always repeat, I continue to repeat it down to the present day, he was too much of a gentleman to say that somebody was wrong. He would never say that. So he divided the world of scholarship into those who catch on fast and those who need more time. So those of us who have produced the RCP volume are those who have caught on fast. We realize that the documentary hypothesis fails at every step. And
Okay.
unfortunately, our colleagues still need more time. But one day they will see the light and they will understand that there is no
Yeah.
basis for the JEDP's dissection of the books of the Torah.
Yeah, hope it's the last of things. So let's continue. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So, question number 2, in terms of composition, and Professor Gane was alluding to it previously, but in terms of composition, scribal practices, textual evidence, and narrative rhetorical devices, how can the wider A&E, ancient Near East, help us better understand the formation of the Pentateuch? Professor Gane.
Yes, well, this is a big question, and it's very much addressed in this volume. As I was mentioning, Joshua Berman and others, a number of others, have been working on this and finding that, in fact, composition practices were similar in the ancient Near East to what we find in the Bible. Some scholars have worked on Hittite texts, and also some have looked at different levels of redaction or editing of some of the canonical compositions, the great epics and myths, and we can see development in those texts. We can see how they have progressed. One of the scholars in here to whom the volume is dedicated, in fact, is our friend Ellen Millard. And he has an essay in here, which is probably one of his last published essays, in which he's pointing out comparisons with the great Mesopotamian myths, epics, and so on and so forth. And we're seeing scribal activity, explicit scribal activity. And we have scribal activity in the Bible. We have the work of editors, clearly. And it's somewhat similar in a number of ways. We also have similar kinds of compositional techniques, literary structures, and those kinds of things in ancient Near Eastern works as well as in the biblical text. Now, I work in the area of cult and ritual, and we have, interestingly, lists of cultic practices and things like that. And just like in the biblical text, we say we don't have enough data here to completely perform this ritual in all of its aspects. We would like to have more data. So it is in the ancient texts. They would assume this is a help along the way for those who are the practitioners, but it doesn't have to give all the information. Now, what is special in the Bible, however, is that we're given theological explanations more than elsewhere. This relates to the God of the covenant, and everything is in this framework. He controls the narrative, he controls the laws, he controls the cult. And so it's put in this larger holistic framework. And in fact, he wants his people to know what goes on behind those closed doors in the tabernacle. Whereas in the outside cultic text, it was sort of a mystery religion in a way, that the priests were these elitists, and they were in the presence of the God, and they did all these things, and the people outside really didn't know what was going on. But the Pentateuch tells us what's going on and gives us just enough for us to get an idea of the reasons. It's cryptic, and so some scholars have been very frustrated by that. But if we look at the evidence that we have, and we look at the patterns that are there, without just eisegeting our own concepts in, we can see that there is definitely a system. There is a cultic ritual system. Expiatory sacrifices, for example, as I've shown in my book, Cult and Character, this is really enacting the demonstration of Adonai's character. His character is enacted in this theodicy, where there was the purification of his sanctuary once a year on the Day of Atonement. And I wrote my PhD dissertation on comparison between that and Hittite and Babylonian rituals of sancti-purification, and found a lot of analogies and similarities. I mean, for example, the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is a day of judgment, very clearly. It judges between the loyal and the disloyal. In Leviticus 16, verse 30, compared with 16, 29, and 30, and so on. And it's recognized in the Mishnah and the Talmud as being a day of judgment, Yom Kippur. Well, what do we find earlier than the time of Abraham? In the non-Shea hymn, published first by Wolfgang Heimpel, who was a teacher at Berkeley when I was there, in the non-Shea hymn, dating to a little before 2100 BC, in Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, we find here a day of judgment for the people who are under the sort of covenant umbrella of the goddess Nanshe, who are recipients of her welfare, who are workers in her temple, and so on, who benefit from her protection, her blessing, and so on. And you find this, you find cleansing of her temple, washing of her temple with water, sprinkling, and so on. And you find also it's a day of judgment for renewing contracts. You find these things in ancient Babylonian ritual at the Akitu festival, the 5th day of the New Year festival of spring.
Yeah.
Now, it's true that texts that we have for those are very late Seleucid period, but likely going back to very early customs. And in fact, Mark Cohen, has written on the cultic calendars in the ancient Near East and found that these practices were very early. So many things that were cultic practices in Israel have their analogies really early. Another thing I've written about was I wrote an article in Andrews University Seminary Studies on schedules for deities. The deities they were fed twice a day in all these cultures, Israelite and non-Israelite, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Hittite, twice a day. And then other ritual elements were fitted in around those things. And so they had similar cultic schedules throughout the ancient Near East, going back to very early times. So to look at the Israelite cultic practices and say, well, these had to be late, invented in the Persian period. No, we have analogies for so many details of these things. And I've made comparisons with a lot of these in the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary on the Old Testament. I wrote the section there on Leviticus, compared with archaeology and ancient texts, showing all of these different patterns. So that's just a little part. Dr. Rendsburg has another whole element that he can add.
Yeah, Professor Rendsburg, we're up.
I'll just piggyback onto one element that Roy Gane has just mentioned, a very technical term, which appears in Leviticus and elsewhere in the books of the Pentateuch. You have a type of sacrifice known as shlamim. And there's a debate as to exactly what it means. It's from the Hebrew, related to the Hebrew word shalom, peace. So it's a peace offering or a greeting offering. Different people, including Roy's teacher, Professor Milgram, have written on it. That word appears in Ugaritic. Exactly that word, shin lamed mem mem. And it is a type of sacrifice which appears in the ritual texts at Ugarit. And that, of course, is from around 1300 or 13th century BCE. That's where we know it from, right? So just one little tangible example of how you have a ritual item, ritual term, cultic term in the sacrificial texts of the Pentateuch, which we know from, from the late Bronze Age, not from, Neo-Babylonian or Persian or even later periods. I'll mention one thing about writing, scribal culture, because we've just been talking about it. There's a wonderful story from ancient Egypt called the Tale of Wenamun. Wenamun was an agent of the great temple to the god Amun in Karnak in Upper Egypt. And he's sent by the priests to go to Lebanon to procure cedar wood. Egypt is very self-sufficient with everything imaginable, huge fields of grain and all the fresh water you need, and gold and everything possible, of course, stone, both limestone and granite in the south. What they didn't have was wood, right? There's, some acacia trees and some palm trees. Really can't build much with those. But for the great gates of all the temples, they would have needed to go to Lebanon to procure cedar wood. And Wenamun goes there. It's the 11th century BCE. He stops along the way in various places, including Dor on the coast of Israel, about halfway between Tel Aviv and Haifa. And he eventually goes to Byblos in the north of Lebanon, north of Beirut. And while he's there, there's a discussion, and they bring out the scrolls. The king of Byblos asks his courtiers to bring out the scrolls so they can read the historical record. Now, this shows you that a culture, Phoenicians in the 11th century, had historical documents, in an alphabetic script, obviously, and they kept these records, and they're written on papyrus scrolls, and they were able to bring them and access them in the court in the 11th century when they were needed. And while Wenamun is there, by the way, another boat from Egypt arrives behind him, and that boat is bringing supplies. And amongst the things it brings to the people of Byblos are blank papyrus scrolls. Now, I do have to say that not everybody agrees that that is what this very rare Egyptian word means, but I think that's what it means, blank papyrus scroll, because Egypt was the only place where you can get papyrus, and they exported the blank scrolls to Israel and Phoenicia and eventually to Greece. And what do the late daters of the Torah say? Well, there was there were no papyrus scrolls in Israel in the 11th century. They had no ability to write. Maybe they did in Byblos because that was an urban Phoenician metropolis, but out there in rural Judea, they would have no access to such material. And they make these proclamations without any evidence, right? I mean, if they could do it in Phoenicia, the Hebrews had the same script, the same scribal techniques. Why couldn't they have had scrolls in the 11th century as well? Of course, we have to point out that because of the climate, all of the papyrus scrolls from Israel, from Phoenicia, from all the surrounding countries in Canaan have all disappeared. We know of what these scrolls look like only because of the ones we have found in Egyptian tombs because of the arid climate. But there is absolutely no reason that they could not have had scrolls, literary compositions, historical records, whatever it might be, in the 11th and certainly 10th century during the time of the monarchy of David and Solomon. One good example of how ancient Near Eastern evidence highlights the composition of the Pentateuch in a way that most scholars simply ignore.
Yeah, that's a strong word, but it's the truth. It hurts, but it's the truth. Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on here. So question number 3, contrary to source critics, you argue for literary structure. Yes, I'm all for that. And unity in the Pentateuch. You both contribute with a chapter to this section of the book. Please give us a summary. So let's go first with Genesis, and this belongs to Professor Rendsburg, and then we'll go with Professor Gane.
Right. So the book of Genesis is divided up into 4 major narratives. Everybody would agree on this. The primeval history, which is Genesis 1 through 11, the Abraham story, the Jacob story, and the Joseph story. Now, if the listeners are asking, where's the Isaac story? The answer is we have very little about Isaac. He appears in the narratives almost always as either the son of Abraham, most famously in Genesis 22, or the father of Jacob and Esau, most famously in Genesis 27. And there are very few stories about Isaac independently, and when there are, they tend to be echoes of some of the Abraham stories, passing his wife Rebecca off as his sister, for example, just like Abraham had done with Sarah. So we have the primeval, the Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph narratives. Those 4, let's just stay with the first, not the primeval, we'll do the Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph narratives. They are all organized in what we call a chiastic structure. You have episode A followed by episode B, followed by episode C, and so on, until you get to a focal point halfway through the narrative. And after that, they are repeated in reverse order. So you'll have an episode E prime, D prime, C prime, B prime, A prime, which match up with the first 5 or 6 episodes in those narratives. And those focal points where the narrative hinge is in the Abraham story, it's where God creates the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17, and Abraham's name is changed from Abram to Abraham. In the Jacob story, it's where Joseph is born, the long-awaited son of Jacob through his favorite wife, Rachel. And it's at that point where Jacob decides to return to the land of Israel. And in the Joseph story, in Genesis 45, it's where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. I'm your long-lost brother, Joseph. So these narrative hinges in these chiastic structures come at crucial points in the narrative. And they show that these are literary units. They are to be read in a unitary or holistic fashion. And you also get lexical links between these matching episodes. In the Abraham story, most famously Genesis 12 and Genesis 22, they both begin with a two-word Hebrew phrase, lech lecha, go forth. In Genesis 12, Abraham goes forth and he goes to the place called Moreh. And in Genesis 22, he goes forth and he goes to the place called Mount Moriah. So you get these verbal and lexical echoes in these matching units. So it's a little hard to explain this without seeing the graphics.
I know.
We have in the book. But you can open up the book and see my graphic representations of all this. Yeah. And these demonstrate literary unity. And of course, if we wanted to, how does the documentary hypothesis look at this? Well, naturally, Genesis 12 is one source and Genesis 22 is another source. A totally blind eye to the fact that this is the only place, not in the Pentateuch, in the entire Bible, where the expression lech lecha, go forth, occurs. This is intentional. This is not random, it happens to be there and it happens to be there. And so you could build on what I've just said for all of Genesis and see that there are these themes that appear throughout. And then let me just add the following.
Sure, by all means.
The three hinges of the Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph stories. In the Abraham story, it's the covenant, as I mentioned, where God makes the covenant with Abraham. In the Jacob story, it's where Jacob wants to return to the land of Canaan upon the birth of Joseph. And in the Joseph story, it's Joseph and his brothers together. And those are the three themes that unite the entire Torah, if not the entire Bible. God's covenant with the people of Israel united in its land of Canaan. Right? And you take those three foci of the three narratives that I've just described, and you see the entire Bible right there before you. Although I have to repeat, nowhere does the text stop to say, pay attention, reader, these are the three places that speak to your theology. You have to engage with the text as a reader and extract the theology, the theological statement that's being made right there. So that's just one example of how the book of Genesis is laid out as a literary whole. And there is absolutely no need to dissect it into its component parts. I know I've been speaking at length, but let me just say one more thing here.
No, go ahead.
Genesis.
Sure.
In Genesis 29, when Jacob meets Rachel at the well, and of course they wed, he decides that he will, he agrees with Laban that he will work for 7 years. He's come as a pauper. He has no means by which to obtain a bride, which is what you had to do in the ancient world. And so he has to work 7 years to obtain Rachel. And the text says there that those 7 years passed in his eyes, keyamim hadim, like a few days. Such was his love for Rachel. The last time you heard that phrase, yamim hadim, a few days, is when Rebekah told Jacob at the end of Genesis 27 to go flee because of the wrath of your brother Esau, and go live with my brother Laban, your uncle, for a few days until the wrath of Esau subsides. Well, those few days turned into 7 years. In fact, they turned into 14 years and then 20 years because he went additional 7 and additional 6.
That hurt.
And you're supposed to see all that as a single unified text. And of course, you can imagine what the JEP dividers do. They take those two phrases and they put them into different sources. Right? Ditto, and then I'll hand this off to Roy Gane, ditto for when Jacob complains to Laban, what have you done? You deceived me. You put Leah in the wedding night, not Rachel. And Laban responds, it's always nice to hear a little bit of Hebrew, right? Laban responds, Lo ye'aseh bimkomenu latetat se'ira livneha bechira. It is not done in our place to put the younger before the firstborn. Well, that's exactly what Jacob did in Genesis 27 by placing himself the younger before the firstborn, Esau, when he deceived his father Isaac. And so this is Jacob's punishment, not exacted by God, although the divine hand is everywhere, but exacted playfully, as it were, by a human. And yet, of course, again, the division of the text into separate sources would see those two passages as separate sources.
Always making sources
Always read
partial.
holistically. And we'll end with that.
Thank you, Professor Rendsburg. Now, Professor Gane, let's go with you. I don't know if you want to add anything relevant to what Professor Rendsburg just said, or if you want to go with your chapter, which is the theme of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, well, first, just a brief PS to what Dr. Rendsburg was saying. Suppose contradictions between different sources, hypothetical different sources. One of the parade examples that is touted by Wellhausen and others up to the present is the issue of profane slaughter. In Leviticus chapter 17, it clearly forbids anyone to slaughter an animal to eat, except as a well-being offering, shlamim, sacrifice. I translate it like my Professor Milgram, well-being offering, shlamim. It's often translated peace offering, okay? This is the same word that shows up in Ugaritic, as Dr. Rendsburg mentioned. And so you had to bring your sacrifices to the sanctuary to slaughter them there. But in Deuteronomy 12 and so on, when you get to the land of Canaan and you're spread out, then you can slaughter your animals there. You don't have to come to the sanctuary, because if it's too far for you, you can just slaughter your animal. But be sure to cover up the blood, bury the blood out of respect for life, of course, that God has given, because the life blood is representing the life of the flesh, according to Leviticus 17:11. Okay, so this is supposed to be two different sources reflecting two different theologies. Wait a minute. Just read the text. The text is saying, here is a situation in which all the Israelites are around the tabernacle, okay? And so they can come and they're required to come to the tabernacle because, for one thing, in Leviticus 17:7, some of them were doing their sacrifices out in the open desert away from people, sacrificing to Seirim, which is goats or goat demons, okay? And like Azazel's goat, for example. And so this, and then in Deuteronomy, it's a different diachronic situation. Now, what's very interesting is that the critics in these cases want to introduce diachronic elements where there are not diachronic elements. And here they ignore a diachronic element when there is one. And the diachronic element is, here's a different situation, a totally different situation requiring a different form of ritual procedure. Not everybody can come to the sanctuary all the time, every time they want to eat a sacrificable animal as a well-being offering. And so this apparent contradiction fails by just simply the wording of the text. If you just take it seriously, when you come into the land and everyone is spread out and it's too far for you, come on, let's listen to the text. But now coming to my essay, which is toward the theme of the Pentateuch, toward the theme of the Pentateuch. Okay,
put it right there.
Yeah, okay,
we can see it.
This was a difficult chapter for me to write because it's so huge, and there are scholars who have written on this. For example, Kleins has written on this, and the question is, what holds it together? Can we read it as a coherent story? And the answer is yes. The macro structure of the whole Pentateuch is an overarching theme going from the perfect world in the perfect Eden up to the borders of the promised land, which is like it's toward a new Eden in that direction. It's not perfect in every way, but at least it's moving in that direction. And they don't totally get there, but they're moving toward it. So the whole Pentateuch really is outlining, just the first couple of chapters has the ideal, and then the rest of it is God's restoration project, as some scholars have recognized. That's the whole point. So how do we deal with it? And then God's in the different narratives, introducing different strategies he has to try to bring people back toward in the direction of the creation ideals. And of course, things really radically fail before the flood, so he just wipes them all out, starts things over again with Noah. And there you have that universal covenant. So the covenants are a huge theme. Covenant with Noah, and then you have a covenant with Abraham, but that then is a limited covenant because God apparently gave up, at least according to the biblical text, he gave up on this universal covenant. He had to work with a remnant, the remnant motif. And the remnant is Abraham and his descendants, which become the Israelites, and he works with them. So most of the Pentateuch is about that, Abraham and his descendants. And you have this overarching narrative. Everything fits into here. The covenant jeopardy of the danger. For example, Abraham goes down into Egypt. He's afraid of losing his life, so he gives his wife into the harem of the Pharaoh, and so on. And you have other jeopardies, including his childlessness and Sarah's childlessness. It was really Sarah's problem because after she died, he had more children. She was a member of the covenant as much as he was, as Tamar Cohen Eskenazi has pointed out. And so he then was given this covenant in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3, which becomes an overarching unifying theme. And that is, I'm going to make of you a great people. You'll have land and descendants and so on. And if anyone curses you, they'll be cursed. If anyone blesses you, they'll be blessed, and so on. And in you, all the nations or the mishpachot of the world are going to be blessed. And this is reiterated then in Genesis 20:18 on Mount Moriah, where he's faithful to the point that he's willing to give up his whole future by sacrificing Isaac. And God stops him just in time before that. But then God says, I can see you're faithful, and God sets it in concrete. Okay, this is for you, and you're a chosen people, and this is a done deal. It's not just a promise, but this is a contract, and he swears by himself, so that the Israelite people have this special role in the world as a channel of his revelation. And if you read it this way, yes, you may have these repetitions, redundancies, inconsistencies, but life is messy, and corporate life of a large group is especially messy. Okay, and they had all kinds of failures, and God had to keep bringing them back to the same kind of tests, and they keep grumbling again, complaining, and he keeps bringing them back to the same text. So you have these redundancies, and you have different ways of approaching them. And then in Deuteronomy, you have Moses, who is then reiterating, reminding them. He can't repeat all of the laws, so you shouldn't expect them all there. But he chooses the ones that are especially relevant for that occasion. So the macro structure of the Pentateuch makes sense. And you have unifying themes, this theme of the covenant, which then shows up in Exodus 6, where God appears to Moses, and he says that here, I'm the God of your ancestors, and he's come to then redeem them from Egypt, as was predicted to Abraham in Genesis 16. It was already predicted, right? And so you've got these unifying themes, but you also have the linkage between one book and the next, so that they almost read as one book. For example, the end of the book of Genesis, the Israelites go down into Egypt with all of the patriarchs, Israelites and their descendants. Book of Exodus begins exactly there. And then it goes through, Exodus goes through, of course, the leaving Egypt and building the tabernacle, introduction to the services. And in Exodus 29 is the prescription for the consecration service, consecrating the tabernacle and the priests. And then in Leviticus, what does it do? Starts off, Adonai speaks to Moses, Vayikra. That's why in the Hebrew, the book is called Vayikra. He speaks to, or calls to Moses from the tabernacle that was just built in the previous chapter. And you have the dedication of the tabernacle. And then it moves through, and you have laws for the people, including pointing ahead. Here's laws for the promised land, and so on, preparing them in this book, Leviticus, that was revealed apparently within the 1 month between Exodus and Numbers. And then they start on the move again. They're ready to go. They've been there for a year at Sinai, eating Adonai's food, drinking his water from a rock. And now they have the tabernacle. They have the constitution for the nation. They're ready to move and go in and take Canaan. And so you have the setting up of the army, which is set up according to tribal structure, which makes perfect sense. And then you move into the narratives. Oh, complaining, all kinds of problems with leadership and miracles going on there to keep them alive. And then you go into Deuteronomy, which is then recapping it all. So you have this progression. It's not like Egyptian or Mesopotamian history, which is cyclical. It goes round in circles. Like in Egypt, it was the rising and the falling of the Nile. It just goes round and round. And in Mesopotamia, it was sort of cyclical as well. This is an ongoing progression, moving towards the promised land. We're supposed to get there, but we don't quite make it. But the next book, we get there in the book of Joshua.
Yeah.
So the overall coherence, the theme, everything is really fitting together as, if you want to call it 5 books, okay, but it's really sequels. Each one is a sequel to the previous one within a unified overall composition. Now, some people refer to a Pentateuch, Genesis through Numbers.
Yeah.
Others refer to a hexateuch, Genesis through Joshua, or
Pentateuch.
and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And you can do what you want. I mean, there's unity in those senses, but
What's next?
Genesis through Deuteronomy, one of the main unifying factors, of course, is after Genesis, you have Moses as a primary unifying factor, and he dies at the end of Exodus. And that's a very key point. You're just before you enter Canaan, and Moses, this great character, dies. Now, it's an interesting issue about pseudonymity. I'll just mention that for a moment. The idea that Moses didn't exist, and yet these things are written. He's towering. The figure of Moses towers above the Pentateuch. In fact, towers above the rest of the whole Bible, including the New Testament. And the idea that you have pseudonymity based upon a fictitious character who never existed. What is the logic of that? I mean, you could come up with something and say, oh, we just found the memoirs of Abraham Lincoln. Okay, Abraham Lincoln. And of course, it's a novel, but this is something that's supposed to have been found, supposed to go back to Lincoln. Well, that kind of thing could convince some people, because people are convinced of anything these days if it's on the internet, right? They could be convinced because there was a Lincoln. There was a Lincoln, and he did write. And we have his style, and we have things about him. But to write a pseudonymous composition, this belongs to someone who never existed. What's the logic of that? It doesn't make any sense.
Like if he didn't contribute anything. Professor Rendsburg, any remarks before continuing to the questions here?
The only thing I would add, and I love that chapter, as Roy said, writing a chapter on the theme of the Pentateuch is a very difficult challenge, and he rose to that challenge. How does one see this very, very long composition? What is the unifying theme? I would add the following, picks up on what we just said about Moses. Most of the, if not all, of the literatures of the ancient world focus on a single individual. So we have Gilgamesh. In the Egyptian world, we have Sinuhe, for example. I mentioned Wenamun. We have the shipwrecked sailor. We have a lot of these from Egypt. The Odyssey focuses on Odysseus, right? The Bible, the individual recedes in the biblical narrative, and it is the collective or the corporate Israel, the Hebrew expression Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, which comes to the forefront. There is a motif, and now I'm really channeling the work of my teacher, Cyrus Gordon. There is a motif in ancient literature called the nostos, or the homecoming. Nostos being the Greek word for homecoming. Obviously, the Odyssey cannot end until Odysseus comes home. And ditto with Gilgamesh, who returns to his city of Uruk. Sinuhe returns to Egypt. The shipwrecked sailor returns to Egypt. We're missing the end of the Wenamun story. It's not extant, but everybody agrees that the story must have ended with his successful return to Egypt, and so on and so forth. Jacob is a mini version of the homecoming motif. He leaves the land of Israel, he goes to live in Aram, and he comes back. But the overarching narrative of the Bible is the collective Israel. Moses is not born in the land of Israel, and he dies before reaching the land of Israel. He is never in his life in the land of Canaan or the land of Israel. But collective Israel does. Collective Israel leaves the land at the end of the book of Genesis. It has the episodic journey home throughout a little bit of Exodus, and mainly the book of Numbers. And then some of that is retold in the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. And only collective Israel returns to the land in the book of Joshua. So it is there's a theological statement to be made there. The single individual is not as important as the corporate entity of the people of Israel. So I'll just leave it at that as, again, one of the themes that we should mention here.
Maybe I'll just add a tiny point to that.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
There's another kind of homecoming, in a sense, because in Genesis, before the fall into sin, Adam and Eve had direct facial access to God. All right. Now, after the fall, that was lost, of course. They couldn't without being destroyed. And God says to Moses, you can't see my face and live. However, in Deuteronomy 34, it says that there has arisen no prophet like Moses who saw the Lord face to face. So that is sort of a return back to the theme of seeing God face to face.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to see God face to face, at least not by now, because I will surely die. But I want to be ready when that happens. I want to be there. Sign me up with that. Okay, let's move on here, gentlemen. Look at that. I promise to be very respectful of your time. Now we're taking a little bit of minutes of there, so please forgive me and give me grace on that. So, the part 6 has to do with the inner biblical reuse in and out of the Pentateuch. In what way does this literary evidence strengthen or contribute to the whole argument of the positive model you argue for, contra documentary hypothesis, of course? Professor Rendsburg.
Well, we could take one, and perhaps Roy Gane should speak about this better than I. We could take the classic example is the prophet Ezekiel. Clearly knows the cultic and ritual material associated with the priestly source from the Pentateuch. I mean, he's interacting with that in every which way. So anybody who puts the P source into the post-exilic or exilic period has to ignore the fact that Ezekiel, is using that material. But you get other prophets, Amos and Hosea, referring to the Exodus stories, and I mean, the Torah must precede all of the material. Otherwise, it makes so little sense. I mean, where is Amos getting the story of an Exodus from? Where is Ezekiel getting the idea of priestly ritual from? But I'll leave it at that because that's a relatively simple and simplified response. And I will ask Roy if he's ready to chime in further on that one.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, one of the big challenges in this whole area of interbiblical reuse, it used to be called intertextuality, and of course it's related to that. But the function of intertextuality has taken on certain kinds of baggage that some of our scholars have wanted to just use a simpler term, reuse. And the methodology of this involves, first of all, determining whether two texts are in a relationship with each other, whether one text knows the other text. Okay, so that's the first thing, to establish if there's a clear literary parallel. And there's certain criteria for determining that. It's not just one thing, but a combination of factors. If, for example, you have something that's very rare here, and it shows up here, and it's very rare here, and it's in a similar context, and that type of thing. Or if this one doesn't make sense without understanding that one. For example, Jeremiah refers to the law of divorce that's in Deuteronomy 24. And he's using it in sort of an allegorical way about the Lord's divorce of Israel, and then kind of puts a twist on it. Is it okay for this to happen? That is in the normal law, but this is what God is doing out of his mercy. Okay. Jeremiah 3, as I remember, if I'd have to look it up, but I thought it was that. Okay, so if you see one is actually using another one in a way that is going beyond what would make sense in a normal usage, then that is likely going to be the later source that's using the earlier one. Okay, so these are just some examples. So once you establish the parallel, then you need to look at the direction of dependence. Okay, if they have a relationship one, which one came first? And a number of scholars have been working on this elsewhere in the Bible, including with Ezekiel. We have scholars like Tuman and Lyons, who are now at the University of St. Andrews. And one of the editors of this volume, Kenneth Berglund, wrote his PhD dissertation on this topic, working on looking at the Pentateuch and the prophets, looking at direction of dependence after identifying parallels, and trying to find out what are some clear, coherent, methodological controls for this. How do we know that we're not just making this up and not assuming, oh, everybody knows, that this one's later and this one's earlier? No, we look at them more carefully and look for real indicators that one is earlier, one is later. Okay, and then another student of mine, I mentioned Felipe Massotti. These were the two students of mine in my Ugaritic class that really started this whole project, which is why we're here. Okay, and Felipe Massotti then went further, and he built on Kenneth Berglund's work and that of others to refine a little bit more of this methodology. And his book is out now. It's called, what is it called? But the wise shall understand. Yeah. But the wise shall understand. Okay, and recently published. So this volume is distilling some of their work, which they wrote together on what is the methodology for determining the direction of dependence. Now, one of the things that scholars have noted, not just in our group, but others have noted, and that is the Pentateuch is not referring to other books, but other books are referring to the Pentateuch. Okay, and you can see that. And Dr. Rendsburg mentioned this. We find the Exodus mentioned in Psalms. We have it in the prophets. We have it all over the place. And a lot of the messages of the prophets don't make sense unless you understand biblical law behind it. They're calling people back to the standard of social justice on these things, which is a very, very strong motif in the prophets. Now, my teacher, I mentioned him, Isaac Kikawada at Berkeley, taught me Akkadian and Ugaritic, and he gave a presidential address at the Pacific region of the Society of Biblical Literature in a number of years ago, and he pointed out that really the three parts of the Hebrew Bible, which are Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the Torah being the Pentateuch, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, really the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim are all based upon the Torah. So therefore, he said that the whole Hebrew Bible is really Torah, Torah, Torah. Now he's a Japanese scholar. So for some in the audience, they thought that was funny, Torah, Torah, Torah. Okay, like Pearl Harbor. But in any case, and then those who are Christian that have to say that the New Testament is really a fourth Torah. It's really everything is based on the Torah. It's the foundation of a civilization. Really, the whole Judeo-Christian civilization is based upon it. We have the earliest Bill of Human Rights there. We have so many things for which civilization is indebted to that. And this is one of the driving forces of our project, because if the Torah is just a bunch of myths that were concocted in the Persian period by priests and wise people and so on and so forth, then what authority does it have over life? Well, history has shown, and what we've found here is that there is an influence that goes beyond ordinary human influence. There's something going on here, and the literature has a genius to it that is remarkable and special, which is why scholars like us, and if you go to the Society of Biblical Literature, there's thousands of scholars studying the Bible, and many studying the Torah, and they have for centuries, because it's so rich, and we're still discovering new insights about the literary structure, the chiasms, parallelisms, and all this kind of stuff. We're discovering new things all the time that are being published about this. How is this possible? There's not any other literature like this. And so what we're showing is that the earliest phase of Hebrew literature that we have, aside from inscriptions, is, and we don't have any earlier inscriptions, is the Torah. And this is the foundation of the whole civilization and the history and everything.
Thank you, Professor King. If I might add, my professor used to say, as an advice, be sensitive to the literary artistry of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as well. Professor Rendsburg, any additional remarks, or we go to the last question? You tell me.
Well, the one topic we haven't addressed sufficiently, we've only mentioned in passing, which I would like to raise is, and it picks up on what we were just talking about, is the linguistic aspect. We have a number of chapters in the book on the dating of biblical compositions. And not only do we have the tools by which we can determine the direction of influence from text A to text B, that we know that the Torah is actually precedes the references thereto in the prophets, and in some cases the Psalms and so on. But we can actually do this linguistically. Linguistics is the #1 objective tool for the dating of any text, full stop, in any language, which is to say, you could tell the difference between Old English, Middle English, represented by Beowulf and Chaucer respectively, Early Modern English, represented by Shakespeare and his contemporaries, 18th, 19th century English, represented by Jane Austen, and 20th and 21st century English, represented by Tolkien and anybody who's writing today, right? I mean, you can tell the difference. If I gave you a text that you'd never seen before, you would be able to determine, oh, that must be contemporary, let's say, with Mary Shelley or Jane Austen or something, and therefore it goes in the early 19th century. Anybody who's fluent in English and has gone through a typical education in an Anglophone setting would not be able to do that. Ditto for Spanish literature and so on. So this is what we can do this for the Bible. We can do this, all right? And in every single instance, with every metric at our disposal, the Hebrew of the Torah has an earlier linguistic profile than the material that comes later. One of our now deceased colleagues, Gane and I knew well, Avi Horvitz of the Hebrew University, wrote a seminal book comparing Ezekiel to the priestly material in the Torah. And it's eminently clear that Ezekiel is later than, we'll call it the P material, the priestly material in Leviticus and other books of the Pentateuch. And we can do this time and again. Just to give the audience one example, if you do or do not know Hebrew, we know what books of the exilic and post-exilic period look like. They are filled with Aramaic forms and Aramaic grammatical forms and lexical items, because Aramaic had become more and more the language of the Neo-Babylonian and Persian Empire. We know books of the Persian period have Persian loanwords in them. So when you read the book of Esther, or you read Ezra and Nehemiah, yes, you're going to see these Persian loanwords in them. Now go look at the Torah. If it's all written in the 6th century, where are the Persian loanwords, right? And the answer is there are none. There are Aramaic forms, and I have published on this, but they are specifically used in 3 places. In Genesis 24, when Abraham's servant goes to Aram, you have Aramaic forms. In Genesis 29 through 31, when Jacob is living in the land of Aram, you have Aramaic forms. And in the book of Numbers, when the Aramean prophet Balaam is brought by the king of Moab to curse the people of Israel, winds up blessing them, of course, you have Aramaic forms. That is to say, only in those 3 sections of the Pentateuch do you have, and it's for literary purposes, right? Because in the first 2 cases, the story is set in Aram. And in the 3rd story, although it's set in Transjordan, you have an Aramaic speaker speaking. The text is still Hebrew, but it's mixed in with Aramaic forms. So this is totally ignored again by those people. And now we segue from the division of the text into the dating of the text. What I have just described is totally ignored by those people who would date these texts to the late monarchic or post-monarchic, exilic and post-exilic period. So I'll just leave it at that as a good way of encapsulating one more aspect of our book.
Professor Gane, you were about to say something. I will say something afterwards.
We have chapters in part 3. Part 3 of this book is called Linguistic Dating of the Pentateuch. And
Yeah.
we have there, first of all, methodology for the linguistic dating of the Pentateuch by Aaron Horncole, who's a real expert. And then we have a chapter by Benjamin Noonan on loan words. What we have in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, is Egyptian loan words, which correlates with the narrative that the Israelites came out of Egypt. There's a whole lot of Egyptian cultural influence on the Pentateuch, which correlates with that narrative. It's not Persia, it's Egypt. And then we have sections on the linguistic dating of narrative text, legal text, cultic text, poetic, hortatory text, and then strata in classical biblical Hebrew by Yoel Elitzur, showing the different levels, the historical phases through which the Hebrew language went. So we're looking at the different genres of literature and looking at the linguistic dating of those genres. So what we find is not only lexical items, but we find some grammatical constructions, some morphological constructions, which appear, the preponderance of usage is in the Torah. And that's something that is not likely to be consciously thought about by a writer. When a writer is writing within their period, there's certain things they think about and certain things they don't. Now, some scholars have said that in the Persian period, there were those skilled scribes who tried to write in the style of the earlier period. Okay, so that's their argument. That's why it's the earlier period that is being represented later, written later. But there's some things which such a person is going to overlook. And we're finding those kinds of things that a later person trying to do that would overlook. Besides, where is the evidence in the ancient Near East for somebody actually doing that or wanting to do that? Why would they do that? What's the motivation for them? A modern scholar can make up stories, and the real motivation is to justify their theory of the modern scholar. But why would an ancient person want to do that? And why would they, again, with regard to pseudonymity, want to highlight this person, Moses? And furthermore, as Bloch has pointed out, he's pointed out this Moses character has his faults as well. And if you were going to just glorify Moses, you wouldn't tell the story that way. In Deuteronomy, he appears to be, according to Bloch, he appears to be he calls him kind of a cranky old man in some ways. and if you were a priestly writer, like scholars say that it was the so-called the priestly material, Leviticus and so on, was written by priests, why would they have Aaron be making the golden calf? Come on, the first high priest is the guy that made the golden calf. And then his sons, Nadab and Avihu, they really blew it, and they're incinerated by the Lord. And it's such a dangerous job. But it's written by them for their glorification, so they can receive the perquisites, the priestly portions coming to them, and they can get rich. It just doesn't add up in terms of, unless you're trying to read your modern conceptions back to justify, again, circularly, like you said, tautologically, trying to justify your hypothesis.
Sorry about that, but I had to say it. Also, here goes another nugget from my professor. It has to do with what Professor Rendsburg was saying just a couple of minutes ago, seconds ago, I should say. People is not taking that, is not including these arguments, like the linguistics arguments he was talking now, because they decided, actively to ignore. And my professor used to say, because it's the fly on the soap, and they don't want to ruin the reality about the text and how the book, the Pentateuch, came about. So that's unfortunate, but that's something that happens in academia. And these two gentlemen, they are true, legitimate scholars. They can attest to that, and it's happening in real time. So I want to just continue here if you don't have any further comments, because we're basically on the last topic here, which has to do with Moses' contribution, which I think we already touched on that a little bit. The faith commitment, which is something very important to me and my audience, to gentlemen. Faith commitment and critical analysis of the Pentateuch. And finally, last but not least, is the debate settled a way forward? So, Professor Rendsburg, just give us your remarks on that, and we're going to come to an end here.
Well, the debate is settled in our eyes. But
Thank you.
we just have to, convince the others.
Yeah.
So I will just say the following. And one can come at this from a whole variety of perspectives on the faith question. You could take it literally, as many Orthodox Jews and fundamentalist Christians do, and so on. You can bring a more historical purpose, a more historical lens to it, which is what I myself do. But to echo what Roy Gane said a few moments ago, this is the foundational text. Whether you believe that God gave these words to Moses or not, whether you see divine revelation, divine inspiration, or totally human authorship in some way, thinking that they were divinely inspired or not, this is the foundational text for Jews and Christians. And we continue to hold to the truths of that material. I can speak as someone who is Jewish and say that we still uphold the ritual material there, observing the Sabbath and the festivals and the dietary laws and circumcision and all the things that are mentioned. If you want to see these as divine ordinances, fine. If you want to see them as cultural identities of the people of Israel, also fine. And just to take this work as the most important work that came out of the ancient world, which still resonates down to the present day. Nobody was reading the Gilgamesh epic after a certain amount of time. Nobody was reading the Sinuhe story after a certain amount of time. Nobody was adhering to Hammurabi's code after a certain period of time. All that had to be recovered in the 19th and 20th centuries through archaeological discovery and the decipherment of the great scripts, cuneiform and hieroglyphic. But this material has been transmitted from antiquity down to the present day directly, first in the hands, and mainly in the hands of Jewish scholars and scribes and adherents, and then later on by the Christian community as well. So I'll leave it at that. That to me just speaks volumes as to why this material is so crucial to our own lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Professor Gane, your turn.
Yes. It's clear that Moses did not write the entire Pentateuch because obviously Deuteronomy 34, it recounts his death. He didn't write about his own death. We don't know who did that. It's anonymous. It's also doubtful that he wrote Numbers 12, verse 3, which says that Moses was the humblest man in the world. I am the humblest, doesn't quite work.
I don't buy that. Yeah.
And another thing that Ibn Ezra, the great medieval Jewish exegete, pointed out is in Genesis 12, verse 6, it says, Va'asa Kanaani ba'aretz. Then the Canaanite was in the land. That is apparently at a previous time. But in the days of Moses, the Canaanite was in the land when he was there in existence. So very clearly, everybody has to admit that there was editing that went on. Now, we have to also admit that there were sources that were used. I mean, for example, Genesis. Even if Moses wrote Genesis, he wasn't around when those things happened. There was a compilation of sources, most likely a lot of oral sources that then were put together, different stories. And that's why sometimes these stories can be a little bit different, told from different perspectives, and we can see what the source critics would refer to as different sources. But and there were different sources, it's true, but there was some genius overall editor who put things together. Now, was that Moses himself, or was it someone later who put it together? Maybe Ezra, who put this together. One huge issue, though, is, and this is really more important than the dating of the actual writing, is the credibility, the plausibility of Moses receiving revelations from God as a prophet. Moses is presented as a prophet. He's not a priest. He's not a priest, so it's not priestly writing. All of this, including the so-called priestly writing, is really, I mean, he's the one who consecrated he officiated the consecration of Aaron as the priest. So it was the prophet who was in charge. Okay. And so this prophetic voice of Moses, was there really a prophet behind this? Are we hearing words of God, divine words? And however you want to fill that in, flesh that out, or whatever you want to believe exactly, it makes a difference for the way you live and for the accountability that you hold yourself to. And that you hold others to, of course.
Sure. Yeah.
So the crucial thing is, are the narratives there of interaction with God? Did God safeguard his people? Did he actually choose the Israelites who have become the Jewish people? Did he actually choose them? Was there a God who actually did that? And what we see is a lot of stories that are giving evidence to build faith. And then when we compare these with ancient Near Eastern texts and archaeological artifacts and all kinds of other things, we see that it really fits the ancient context. One factor in Genesis, for example, that scholars have noticed is that the patriarchs moved freely from one part of the ancient Near East to another. That wouldn't have been so easy in the first millennium as it was in the second millennium. So the narrative scene, that is the picture of what was going on at the time, is involving, yes, Mesopotamia, Egypt, all of these kinds of things. But the element of faith is whether we believe that God was actually working with and through these people, that there really were covenants, that Abraham really was chosen and his descendants, that he gave these laws and these rituals, which are for our edification. So as far as whether the debate is settled, of course, it's not settled in the world as a whole. For us, it's settled that we have
It's settled. Yeah.
we have a higher view of the authenticity and the earlier dating and the credibility and therefore the authority of the Torah in our lives. And this, the value of the authority is really demonstrated by the effects in history, where the principles of the Torah have been applied in society. It's been a positive thing. It's been a benefit. It's not just apparently human wisdom for their own political correctness, which is always self-serving, right? Always self-serving.
Yeah.
There's an unselfishness there. There's a love there, which is not normal to fallen human beings like us. And if we would listen to its principles much more and pay attention, I'm Christian, I'm Seventh-day Adventist. So if we would pay much more attention to these laws, not just saying the 10 Commandments are it and the rest is Mosaic and it's abolished. That's not what the Bible is teaching. The others were principles from the 10 Commandments, or expanding on this theme of love your neighbor as yourself, love the Lord your God, which are things Jesus alluded to, right? Matthew 22, 37 to 40. That's two texts from the Torah, which sums up the whole thing. This is core Christianity, is to accept these principles. And we need to, the Apostle Paul in Ephesians and elsewhere refers to these principles as things that we need to accept, even being quite specific in Corinth, even about the incest laws in 1 Corinthians 5. So we should pay a lot more attention. And if we do, and look at the underlying principles, because these laws come to us dressed in ancient Near Eastern dress, right? But we have to look at the underlying principles and see how they apply. So I wrote a book about that called Old Testament Law for Christians. And I think that this will help Christians to understand a lot better the practical relevance of the Bible for them and how God has been helping us and can help us now. I think that book can also help to counter anti-Semitism.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of Christians think that Jews are just legalistic and they make fun of these laws. I've heard some of that stuff. And they react against all of that without understanding what's going on. God has been leading people through history. And that's a very important heritage, which is part of our story, our heritage, even though, we did a DNA test and my mother's heritage has less than 1% Jewish. Okay. So I have just a little tiny smidgen. But we don't have that proud heritage. I wish I had more. And yet we have the cultural, the moral, the ethical heritage, which can make us better people in this world that desperately needs that.
Preach it. Oh my goodness. That's a good note to end on. So This has been an awesome conversation. Thank you for just sharing your
Can
time
I just
with us.
can I just say to that?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead, Professor Rendsburg.
All I wanted to do was say to Roy's final words, Amen, Amen.
Amen. Yeah. Amen. Amen. I will say in Spanish, Amen. Amen. No, I was just saying thank you. Thank you for this episode, this time together. I promise I steal from you more than expected. Please forgive me on that. But I always say here in these episodes, this kind of interview doesn't do justice to the topics that we brought up to the table of discussion. But we try, trust me, we try along with the scholars coming here to the show to, just to give the bullet points here for you to think better, to be a better reader, to be a better, documented, educated person on this topic, which are very important. The topic of the Pentateuch is, as they both have been saying since this interview started, it's foundational. It's foundational. So we need to be a little bit more, prepared and interested in this kind of topic and take hold of the latest of scholarships who has been put out there. So, gentlemen, final remarks, final comments before coming to an end.
By the way, I think everybody should
just hope that
everybody should be sure to read the appendix. It's
okay.
really
put it right there. Yeah. Okay.
The appendix is
there you go. Yeah.
What it's doing is it's applying source criticism the kind that's used by the critics to have the documentary hypothesis. This is a parody by David J.A. Klein's New Directions in Pooh Study. So it's applying those methodologies to the story of Winnie the Pooh, and it's given a good German name, Überlieferungs- und religionsgeschichtliche Studien zum Pooh-Book. Okay, and so applying that and seeing what happens with this, we clearly know who wrote it, but he's applying it and coming out with different sources and so on. And so it shows the subjectivity of that kind of analysis. Dr. Rendsburg knows more about that than I do.
Thank you. Professor Rendsburg, you were about to say something.
I mean, I think our biggest wish, and the appendix by the late David Kleins, who passed away just a few years ago, is absolutely worth reading. In fact, I would suggest, now that Professor Gane has mentioned it, when you buy the book, hopefully you start with the appendix, because you'll get a sense of what we are attempting to do. But our big hope is that people buy the book and absorb its contents. To go back to where we started this podcast, the essays are accessible. They are 6 to 8 pages. Maybe the longest one is 10 pages. They're in clear English, simplified English. Every Hebrew word appears both in Hebrew, transliteration, and translation, so people will be able to access the material at whatever level they come from. If you're a student, if you're a scholar, if you're a lay person, regular attender of church or synagogue, or we ask you to just read the book. It's really just a wonderful access to the field of biblical studies today.
Yeah, and then think about the implications of the conclusions that you arrive at. Everybody should study for themselves. I have a mantra that I say to my students and to those with whom I speak in public. I say, I have 2 fears in teaching and speaking. My first fear is that people will not believe me. My second fear is that they will. So don't take our word for it. Read, study for yourself, but look at the data. Look at the hard data, come to a conclusion, and then let that absorb into your worldview and let it transform your life.
Thank you so much for that. And that's why we're doing this kind of job. No, it's my pleasure. I just want to ask you, before letting you go, that German title that you just read, is that Martin Knott's famous book? Or am I wrong?
Well, this is there at the as
the one on DJ Klein's, that German title that you read?
Right. It's New Directions in Pooh Studies. And then the subtitle of the chapter, which is an appendix, is Überlieferungs- und religionsgeschichtliche Studien zum Pooh-Book. So it's a tradition and religious history studies in the Pooh book. Okay. So he's really parodying.
No, I got it.
critical methodology. You can read a lot of
Yeah.
these terms that are used for by the critical scholars who are
I
developing
see why
source
he did
criticism.
that. Yeah,
You know,
I see why he did it that way.
traditions,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mhm.
All right, people in the audience, who's gonna be watching later this video, just take advantage of this interview. I can't add any more than my guests did just now. I'm gonna be dropping some links here again, so you can go and click. And if you want to buy the book, please buy it, entertain yourself, and educate yourself, because it's so much needed. Also, just keep an eye on our future interviews with scholars. We're trying to be the top-notch of scholarship available out there. Proof of that is just the gentleman that we just have here in this episode. I'm beyond measure thankful to Professor Rendsburg and Professor Gane for their time and for coming to the show. I hope this won't be the last time. To everybody out there with Professor Rendsburg and Gane, we tell you until the next time. Bye-bye. Let's take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.